So there was a basic impulse that remains of great concern. How do you improve the expectations academically for all children, and also increase your academic expectations for your higher performing students, which was what we did in Massachusetts when I was in the Department of Education helping to develop our standards. Our goal was not to help only the low 30%, but to raise the entire boat, every student. How to raise higher achievers. Why? Because even our higher achievers weren't as competitive with those in other countries. So the idea was that we wanted to raise all demographic groups, boys and girls, however they were divided. And equal expectations has been a strong selling point for Common Core. As a selling point, because we still don't have any evidence from anything that it will accomplish any of that. Now, those were the positive things. I'm now going to talk about some of the negative aspects that I particularly became concerned about as a member of the validation committee and as an academic researcher, which is what I am by trade. I have been at the University of Arkansas for the past 5 years, and I've just retired. But I still write analyses, and I do a lot of research work, analytical work, writing about Common Core and other issues with teacher training. It's good to have as a goal equal expectations, at least in the early grades. But what I objected to philosophically and practically is having low expectations, equally low expectations. I have told many people at many meetings, I am philosophically not a libertarian. I believe that we can have state standards or possibly good national standards, but they have to be first class. Otherwise, there's no point in having them. Why would we want to have either state or national standards if they're third rate? That was the basic issue for me when I did my examinations of the English language arts standards, because my area of expertise is not in mathematics, it's in reading and in literature. I'm going to now give you some examples of some of the problems in 6 to 12, because I will say, and probably many superintendents will tell you, that they do not see many of the problems in Common Core's K-5 standards particularly. Their elementary teachers may not be trained to teach math as well as they should be, but they don't see as any great problems with local control being threatened in any way in K-5. The basic problems are in 6 through 12. That's a huge number of grades to be concerned about. And what I'm going to say opposes a lot of the claims of Common Core's advocates, who claim that these are rigorous standards in math and in English language arts. They're not rigorous at all, which is why the word rigorous is used over and over and over again. If you ever listen to anyone talk about Common Core, they're going to use the word rigorous every third word, which tells you they've got a message or they've got a problem. If they were rigorous, they wouldn't have to repeat it over and over again. It's to reassure themselves, because they have bought snake oil, which is what I see as the real problem there. As I've said, they're not competitive, they're not research-based, and they're not internationally benchmarked. Contrary to what is claimed, they don't develop critical thinking. That's another part of the snake oil. And I'm sorry, it doesn't sound very academic, but if people keep telling you they're developing critical thinking, you have to ask, well, how are they doing it? What are they doing? What do you mean by critical thinking? I know that what analytical thinking is, but I don't think they see critical thinking as analytical thinking. I will just say arbitrarily, they do not prepare students for authentic college-level coursework in either math or English. Now, for the math, I rely on the judgment of the one mathematician on the validation committee who also didn't sign off. This was a strange validation committee. 25 people, one English language arts expert, one mathematician, and all the rest were either in education schools or in test development or in other areas. So the one mathematician who looked at the standards and has printed or made available his critique in detail, his name is James Milgram. He's an emeritus professor of mathematics at Stanford University. He says by grade 8, American children are 1 to 2 years behind their competitors. So this is his mathematical judgment based on the topics that he sees in Common Core's math standards. Back to English. There are some other problems with the English standards. The main one being that the English curriculum is divided 50-50. This was the brainchild of one of the standards writers, whose name is David Coleman. He was chosen by the Gates Foundation to write the English standards. Why? I still don't know, because he's never taught, and he's never taken any education courses, and he doesn't really understand curriculum and instruction, but he decided that English teachers or reading teachers should teach 50% informational or nonfiction texts and the other 50% literature. Well, that is not what English teachers are trained for. They are trained in English courses to teach literature. But he decided, this is the element that as a civic-minded person all my life I find very grating, he decided, for the sake of these standards, that students could do better in college if they studied informational reading 50% of the time. The percentages are there from K to 12. No research base for it. I've asked reading researchers. There's no empirical research whatsoever. He just made it up. He also made up another pedagogical practice. This is another thing you've lost control over in the curriculum, if you want to know what you've lost control over. You've lost control over what kinds of texts the teachers will teach. 50-50 is the division in the standards. So anyone who says we haven't lost local control is missing the fact that you already have lost that. English teachers have been told they must divide 50-50, and they've rearranged their curriculum to cut down on literary study. But Coleman has also said that when you read historical documents, there are a few that are required and a few standards in the English standards for Common Core. He says you come in with a cold reading, C-O-L-D. What he means by that is not bringing in the context, and he uses as an example Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. Now, a lot of people get excited when they see that because they think, that's wonderful, we're going to have the Gettysburg Address taught. But how do you interpret the Gettysburg Address if you don't have any historical context for it? Where did Lincoln say it? Why did he say it? How do you understand the meaning of it if you don't understand the Civil War to begin with and all the rest that led up to it? But Coleman says, for the sake of quotes, leveling the playing field, he wants historical ignorance. Now, this is a strange way to approach the understanding of a historical document, and I will say that over and over again, because most English teachers who've heard that are dumbfounded. It's never occurred to them that you would ever approach any speech that way. Doesn't matter where the speech is, you have to understand who is the audience, what was the purpose, why it was given all together there. But that's a piece of it. So we have reduced literary study, we have decontextualized study of historical documents by English teachers who aren't trained as history teachers. We have an incoherent approach to whatever literature is studied because all the document cares about is an increasing level of complexity. And I won't go into the details about how you decide how complex a text is, because the document provides you with a number of factors that you would look at to decide how complex a literary work actually is. But if you think about this notion of critical thinking, which is what I did with a professor of English at Emory University named Mark Bauerlein, we've worked together on a paper for the Pioneer Institute, we concluded that if you really want to try to pinpoint where kids learn to do critical thinking in high school, it comes from having to read complex literature, particularly poetry, because that's where you struggle to try to figure out what the poet was saying with very simple, often monosyllabic words in English. And I remember an example just last November at the National Council of Teachers of English. Famous poem by Wordsworth that begins with the line, "My heart leaps up when I see a rainbow in the sky." And one of the lines in the poem was, "The child is father to the man." There were 85 English teachers, and it was like you were throwing fish out. They snapped at the bait. This is exactly what English teachers love. How do you help your kids interpret that line? They went crazy for an hour. I mean, this is exactly what English teachers love to do, whether we like what they like to do or not, but this is what they're trained to do. How do you interpret that one short sentence, "The child is father to the man"? How do you go into the poem? How do you read between the lines, the subtleties, et cetera, et cetera? That's how you learn to think critically, so that when you approach older, more mature, more difficult words, dense texts, you think about, well, what's going on behind or between the lines or in the mind of the writer? But in any event, that shows you what English teachers are trained well to do, and where most of us, without knowing it, probably learn to do some critical thinking. Usually we did it with a Shakespeare play. How do you interpret to be or not to be? It's just simple words. But what does it mean? How do you know what it means? What do you look at? What's going on that helps you to understand it? That's what the English teacher's trained to do, not to take a trivial text on computer nerds or computer geeks or teenage marketing, which is something I've seen suggested in NCTE, National Council of Teachers of English Literature, as informational reading, because when people try to write persuasively to sell you something, they're not going to be subtle. They make it very clear what they want you to buy and why they want you to buy it. So you're not learning to do critical thinking through the words, through the actual text. In any event, you have these problems with a set of standards that were developed by people who were not English teachers, had never taught, and had no great understanding of the curriculum and how instruction interacts with it.